After serving his country for months, he had done a great job. With scars, marks, and pride, all he wanted was to spend the afternoon enjoying good food and good company in peace. But when the manager saw him enter, she had different plans. No one could have guessed how badly things would go. As Richard entered the restaurant for his dinner, he hadn't anticipated this happening. It had been getting good reviews and he wanted to check it out. As soon as he stepped onto home soil after spending 6 months fighting, he vowed to visit this place. What surprise awaited him if he only knew what it was before returning home. Private First Class Richard Vaughn spent half a year on the front lines. Even though he was only 23 years old, he had already accomplished a lot. Richard enlisted in the Marine Corps after graduating from high school. In addition to fulfilling his lifelong dream of joining the force, he wanted to make his family proud, just as many motivated young people do today. Richard dedicated his entire life to becoming a Marine. After completing all the required steps, he was deployed several months later. As Richard fought alongside his fellow citizens, fully armed, he made his country proud. Soon, his deployment ended and a new chapter began. While stationed in Tampa, Richard heard his friends and Marine buddies talking about a fancy restaurant near the base. Being from Chicago, Richard didn't know much about Florida, but he wanted to explore. However, the experience he was about to have at that restaurant would be unlike anything he had ever faced. Richard left the Marine base wearing his combat uniform and carrying a duffel bag over his shoulder. Even though it was late afternoon, the sun was still hot and bright. The air felt warm, filled with the kind of love you only feel at home. As he hailed a ride, he smiled, happy to be back. But his day wouldn't go as planned. He tossed his duffel bag into the trunk of his truck and started the engine. He was already imagining the delicious food he would eat. After 7 months of eating Army food, he was craving something tasty and fresh. The drive to the restaurant was quick, with only a few cars passing him on the nearly empty roads. When he pulled into the parking lot, he jumped out of his truck, a smile on his face. He had seen a picture of this place while on duty, and now everything looked just like he imagined. Richard left his duffel bag in the truck and walked toward the restaurant. As he entered through the glass doors, he was greeted by a well-dressed concierge. Richard, wanting to keep things friendly, gave him a respectful smile, but the man looked at him from head to toe with a frown. In a fancy, almost European accent, the concierge asked, "Can I help you?" While twirling his mustache, unsure if Richard belonged there. Richard nodded in response. "A reservation was made at the restaurant, so I wanted to check it out," Richard said. "Oh," said the concierge, "were you planning on dressing like that?" "Yes," answered Richard. He'd already noted that he was the only one not dressed in a crisp black and white suit in this immaculate space. Even his truck in the parking lot looked out of place, surrounded by luxury sedans as far as the eye could see. But Richard wasn't here to impress anyone. He only wanted to eat and fulfill an oath to an army buddy. The concierge quickly checked his computer and then led Richard into the restaurant. "Right this way, sir," he said. Inside, the cool, refreshing atmosphere was a stark contrast to the hot air outside. Soft piano music played and servers moved around with large plates of food. Richard felt like he was in the right place, unaware that he was being watched. A waitress took over, giving him a quick once-over before leading him to his reserved booth. She handed him a menu, smiled, and walked away. As Richard looked over the menu, his thoughts drifted back to the front lines and his eyes grew glossy as he remembered the true reason he was there. You see, while on duty, he and his closest buddy, Gary, had talked about what they'd want to do the minute they got home. Richard told Gary he wanted to drive home to his family first. He wanted to show them all the incredible medals he'd earned and the fantastic photos he'd taken. He wanted to talk to his dad about the horrors he'd witnessed because, like him, his dad had been a serviceman. But what was Gary's wish? Unlike Richard, Gary Ford had grown up without biological parents. After spending years in several foster homes, he found his family with the Marines. He finally felt seen, loved, and appreciated. Unlike Richard, this was Gary's second deployment. They had started their relationship as enemies, with Gary constantly butting heads with Richard. But that changed as soon as the two were beyond enemy lines. A strong bond was formed between the two battle brothers, and for months they spent time trading stories of where they were from. Gary, a Tampa native, often talked about the restaurant and its amazing Italian food. A few other Marines who had lived in Tampa agreed, saying it was a must-visit. They encouraged Richard to go when he got back home, and Gary even offered to take him there, promising a great time. Over time, Richard and Gary had become best friends, inseparable unless ordered apart by their corporal. Visiting the restaurant had been their plan for months, but tragedy struck. Gary was killed in a deadly attack, and in his final moments, he begged Richard to keep their plan alive. Sitting in the restaurant alone, Richard remembered those moments vividly, fighting back tears. He wasn't just there for the food. He was there to honor his best friend, who had saved their team and sacrificed himself. Gary had been brave, selfless, and everything Richard hoped to be one day. Gary had even suggested a lineup of dishes to try, explaining how each would complement the others. "I wish you were here, bud," Richard whispered as he ordered. But as he waited for his meal, he felt uneasy, noticing the intense gaze of the restaurant's concierge, the same man who had eyed him disapprovingly at the entrance. Their eyes locked, and Richard felt uncomfortable, unsure if it was his uniform or something else. When the food arrived, it looked incredible, and Richard imagined Gary sitting across from him sharing stories. But when the bill came, Richard's heart sank. He couldn't help but think of Gary and how much he would have loved the meal. Discreetly, Richard made a toast in his friend's honor, whispering, "To you, Gary. May we meet again on the other side." As Richard continued his meal, he still felt some uneasiness. It felt like the whole restaurant was staring at him as if eyes were boring into his back. He felt very uncomfortable because he knew he seemed a little out of place in the fancy restaurant. But still, he wasn't going to let some people ruin his day. He was there for a special reason, and Gary would want him to ignore what was bothering him and have a great day. Gary was a cheerful guy, and Richard hoped his cheerfulness would someday rub off on him. He was an anxious mess, and it all stemmed from his time on the front lines of war. But today, he just wanted to forget about it. As the waitress brought around more food, the Marine ordered his plates one after the other. He started with the appetizers, followed by the main course, and then dessert. Everything was cooked to perfection, but Richard couldn't immerse himself in the food when his friend wasn't there with him. He knew he would have to drive to his grave soon, and that alone withered his insides. But for now, he needed to finish his plate. The Marine finished everything he'd ordered and asked for the bill. He calculated everything while ordering and knew he wouldn't spend more than $70 on the meal. But when the waitress handed him the bill, he shot to his feet. "Excuse me," he called. "I think there's a problem with my bill." The waitress glanced at the bill and then back at Richard, seemingly unfazed by his concern. "I assure you, sir, the bill is accurate," she said in a tone that made it clear she wasn't going to back down. Richard stared at the numbers on the bill, feeling his blood boil. The total amount was staggering. He had expected a reasonable bill, considering he had meticulously planned his order within his budget. As Richard's frustration mounted, a man approached their table, exuding an air of authority. It was the concierge. "Is there a problem here?" he inquired with a raised eyebrow. Richard's military discipline held him in check, but his voice trembled slightly as he responded, "Yes, there's a problem. This bill is way higher than it should be. I calculated everything, and it doesn't add up to this." With his nose in the air, the concierge replied, "We do not make mistakes here. Perhaps your calculations are wrong." Richard gasped at the audacity. He knew he wasn't wrong. He had eaten 3 courses and made sure to look at the prices before he ordered. $70 was all he could spend in this place. "Could you please have a look again? I wasn't prepared for this exorbitant amount," Richard pleaded, but it looked like his pleas fell on deaf ears. The concierge gave him a sour look and walked off as he politely and enthusiastically greeted a glamorously dressed couple who had just arrived. Richard knew that they were not going to let up. He looked around in confusion. By now, it looked like a few of the patrons had been looking his way and shaking their heads in disgust. Richard felt like he just wanted to get up and leave the place, but how was he going to do that when he was staring at a huge restaurant bill? The waitress came rushing back. She looked at it and said, "I believe it's correct, sir." But it wasn't. For some reason, the restaurant had tacked an extra $130 onto Richard's $70 bill, making it a hopping $200 for a plate of Capri salad, spaghetti bolognese, and tiramisu. Livid, Richard asked to see the manager, but the man was impassive. He looked at Richard's Marine uniform and said, "Your uniform isn't meant for such places, young man. It's an eyesore here. The $130 for our effort to protect the rest of our honored guests from looking at you." Richard's eyes went wide. "Excuse me?" he asked. The manager repeated what he'd said, this time louder despite being a foot away from Richard. "Settle that bill if you can and leave my restaurant." It took everything for Richard not to do something rash on the spot. He was still reeling from having to eat his food alone without Gary by his side. Giving the manager one last look, he told him he wouldn't be paying an extra $130 because of his uniform. That's when it happened. The manager called 2 security guards, who, after looking at Richard, called in 3 more guards. One of them, the biggest, took Richard by his shoulders. Before the Marine could retaliate, the other guards held him in place. "You will pay that bill," the manager sneered as the men escorted Richard outside. "Take his ID," the manager commanded, waving it before Richard's eyes. He said, "Pay the bill, and we'll give this back." They left Richard in the parking lot, trembling from his anger. He'd always been a man of few words, a man of action. He turned to the trunk of his car and grabbed his duffel bag. He would teach the manager and his goons a lesson. Richard was about to head into the restaurant when he suddenly hesitated. Was he really about to do what his mind was pushing him to do? "No," he mumbled, covered in sweat. "There's a better way." He hopped into his truck and raced back to the base. A minute later, he was standing before one of his superiors, the corporal who led his and Gary's fire team. Richard explained what happened at the restaurant, saying he'd only gone there to fulfill his oath to their fallen brother. Luckily for him, his corporal had been there when the two were making plans. He'd even given them a few other restaurant recommendations. Without wasting time, he asked Richard to follow him. The corporal led Richard to another superior's office where he explained everything. The superior, a grizzled older man with leathery toned skin, salt and pepper hair, and piercing blue eyes, made a phone call. 4 Marines walked through the door, saluting before standing still. "Show us, son," the superior said before he and his Marines filed out of the office. Everyone jumped into 2 military vehicles and drove to the restaurant. With Richard's corporal and their superior in the front seats, they didn't even wait for the drivers to park before they jumped out of the vehicles and marched into the restaurant. Richard was quick behind them, wondering what they'd do. The air in the restaurant immediately turned sour the moment the superior entered, clad in full Marine gear. He kept his hand just above his holster, his eyes narrowed as he searched for the manager. Finding him, he said, "Give me his ID now, or I will start looking for it myself." When the manager handed it over, the officer walked past him and jumped at a counter. "All active duty military," he announced. "This site is now on the prohibited list. Pay your tab and get out." He got down and walked out with half the restaurant following him. Richard hadn't seen them when he was last there, but he could tell many were either reserve or retired military. The restaurant went on the list and remained there when Richard transferred out of Tampa 6 months later. Richard was shocked as events spiraled out of control at the restaurant. He never imagined things would escalate like this. The superior's actions left no room for compromise, and the whole scene felt like a movie. As the manager struggled with angry customers, Richard's corporal reassured him, "You did the right thing coming to us. We've got your back." Relieved and grateful, Richard realized he wasn't alone. His fellow Marines were there to support him. The patrons who followed the superior outside patted Richard on the back, showing their solidarity. It reminded him of the strong bond he had with his military brothers, even off duty. The manager, now dealing with the fallout, watched as customers left, angry at how an active duty Marine had been mistreated. The restaurant's reputation suffered a major blow, and Richard felt a sense of satisfaction as the manager understood the consequences of his actions. Before leaving, Richard exchanged a brief, understanding glance with the apologetic waitress. As he stepped outside into the warm Tampa air, his heart felt lighter. He knew his mission wasn't over. He was determined to fight for justice, inspired by the memory of his fallen friend and the unwavering support of his Marine brothers.